welcome everyone. I know there'll be a couple more people trickling in, so that's great, but why don't we go ahead and get started so we have time for lots of dialogue and questions. I just want to remind everyone, I'll come back up at the end and close us out, but we have a reception just following our session, so we invite you to stay for the reception and have a little bit of food with us and talk with our speakers and talk with each other. So great. Well, welcome. I'm Aaron Goldenberg, professor and vice chair in the Department of Bioethics here at Case, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the second annual Patty Marshall Lecture on Genomics and Equity. I want to also reiterate thanking those of you who are joining us online. We're streaming live, and so there are people both in our community and across the country watching, so welcome, and we're looking forward to talking with all of you. This lecture series is one of the centerpieces of our newly launched Bioethics Center on Community Health and Genomic Equity. Our mission is to support and foster community-engaged research, education, and service that advances health and healthcare equity through all of genomics and genomics research. This lecture is named for Dr. Patricia Marshall, who has dedicated her scholarship, teaching, and service to work that identifies the ways in which genomic technologies can be used to better address health disparities and inequities, and just as importantly, to provide opportunities for underrepresented voices to be included as essential partners in promoting equity in genomics, medicine, and research. Before I introduce Dr. Marshall and Dr. Royal, our guest of honor for today, I have just a few quick thank yous. I want to first thank the Department of Bioethics, Mark Alicio, and the Department of Bioethics for their support for today's session and for the work of our center. I also want to thank our center's Associate Director, Marcia Mickey, who's here in the audience, and our newly appointed Scientific Director, Dr. Lynette Gerardo, who joined us as a faculty member just this summer. I also want to thank our amazing staff whose work over the last few weeks to get ready for today has just been invaluable, and a special thank you to Roselle Ponceron, there she is in the back, who really made this day work and really makes our center and so much in our department work. Thank you so much for your work. I have one more thank you before I move on to my formal remarks about Dr. Royal and introduce Dr. Marshall. I want to thank Dr. Eric Juengst, who's here in the audience. As many of you know, Eric was a faculty member here for many years and very much established Case Western as one of the strongest centers for work associated with the ethical, legal, and social issues associated with genetics and genomics. Eric was the first and founding director of our NIH-funded Center on genetic research, ethics, and law. As you see the sea grail, the grail out in front, holding candy that we try to bring to as many of our events as we can. Our new center and this lecture is a continuation of the legacy that he has established in us being one of the primary and premier centers to address ethical, legal, social issues in genetics and genomics, and a dedication to equity work in that scholarship. As some of you know, Eric is retiring at the end of this year, and we wanted to take a special moment to just thank him for his dedication and everything he's done for us, because we all wouldn't be here without him. So just a quick thank you so much. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce Dr. Marshall, who will say just a quick words about Dr. Royal, but I wanted to do a little bit more of a formal introduction. Our guest of honor today, Charmaine Royal, is the Robert O. Kohani Professor of African and African American Studies, Biology and Global Health and Family Medicine, and Community Health at Duke University. She also directs the Center on Genomics, Race, Identity, Difference, and the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Dr. Royal's research, scholarship, and teaching focus on ethical, social, scientific, and clinical implications of human genetics and genomics research, particularly issues at the intersection of genetics and race. Her specific interests and primary areas of work include genetics and genomics in the African and African diaspora populations, sickle cell disease and trait, public and professional perspectives and practices regarding race, ethnicity, and ancestry, genetic ancestry inference, and broadly defined genotype environment interplay. And just a very quick word of just personal note is that when I was a PhD student, Dr. Royal invited me down to be a visiting scholar for a little over a week at Howard University, and it's during that visit that I first got incredibly interested in the intersection between genetics and equity. So much of the work that we see here also stems from Dr. Royal's work and her dedication to the work that we do and to welcoming our students and our faculty as part of her family. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Marshall, Dr. Patricia Marshall, to just say a few words about Dr. Royal.
good to be here, Patty. Good to be here in your neck of the woods.
I'm happy and honored, and we go way back. Way back. Way back. Oh, can you not hear me?
For the streaming, Patty.
Oh, here's Charmaine.
No, you go ahead, Patty, because you're going to speak first.
No,
and then I'll
well,
speak later.
but, okay. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I want to say thank you all for coming and just being here. It's, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of all of you students and you guys over there and you guys over here and just about everybody. It means a lot to me. It really does. And what is especially wonderful is to see Charmaine. You all, I just have to tell you, and I know you'll.
What are you going to tell him?
We have had many adventures.
Yes, we have.
Together.
Indeed.
Why, Charmaine, do you remember that time in Kenya?
Which time in Kenya, Patty? There were so many.
We both had the good fortune to be involved with the HapMap project. We don't need to explain that so much,
No,
I
we
don't
don't.
think.
Is that when the bus broke down?
Yes.
And we were on the side of the road?
Yeah.
With the baboons and the...
Yeah, yes. And another, we were involved in the HapMap project, the development of a haplotype map for the human genome. So now you all who know stuff about genetics, genomics, we're talking the old days. So this was like, oh my gosh, it began, we got involved early 2000s. And Charmaine and I both worked on the African site. So this was an international initiative. And we worked with our dear friend, Charles Rotimi and Clement. And so the adventures go on and on, including, for example, do you imagine we're in Kenya, there is a drought happening. Do you remember?
I do remember that.
And we met with elders, remember? And because we're asking their permission to essentially collect DNA samples from individuals in their community. And these DNA blood samples were going to be used for the HapMap project. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot to explain, okay? And then, do you remember we went to a Maasai homestead?
Yeah.
You all, the dirt, what should have been grass, and it was dirt, so you could put your hand down and just, the ground would just, there was nothing. And the mother's son had to walk, correct me, 15 kilometers to collect water. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But, oh yeah. Those memories are...
Lots of good memories.
Lots of good memories, and we learned so much.
We did.
And I won't share some of the other stories about but I have to say, I'm so honored that you could be here. Charmaine is a real star. We were young, although, honey, I'll always be older than you. But we were coming up we were coming into our own. Mm-hmm. And now, here you are.
Giving the Patty Marshall
I know, excuse me.
That's exciting.
What is it's more than this. I mean, come on, Charmaine. African and African American Studies, Biology, Global Health.
Global health.
Family yeah, of course, of course. I'm just proud, and I've talked too much.
Oh, it's
I
my
love
turn,
you.
I
I'm
guess.
so happy to
Love
see
you too, Patty.
you.
It's great to be here. Great to be here. So good to do this.
That's called giving a hug as tall as I am. And trust me on this, you want to be in my embrace.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank
I'm
you,
gonna
Patty.
switch down.
All right. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Hello. Okay, yes. I wanted to hear back from you. That wasn't a rhetorical hello. So it's great to be here, and I am just truly honored to do this in Patty's honor. And thank you, Aaron and Marcia and the rest of the group for inviting me to be here. And when I thought about what am I going to say coming here, and you see my title there, Genomics and Equity in the 21st Century, I thought long and hard about how I would do this talk. What was it going to be like? And I decided that it was going to be a little different from, at least I think it is, from a regular academic talk. I'm going to invite you to dream with me a little bit, to envision with me. Well, let me just get into my talk. Genomics and equity. And there's been a lot of talk about equity over the years, not just in genomics, just everywhere. And I'll just throw out the question: when I say equity, what comes to mind? How do you define equity? Anybody who just wants to jump in and just say how you define equity. There are all kinds of ways that we could define it. Anybody? Somebody over here. Oh, we need mics in the, okay. No, go ahead.
You can just repeat what they say.
Okay.
The achievement of equality through different means for different projects.
So you used another word there, equality, right? And we often think about those as different, don't we? Equity and equality, and I'm going to show something, but that's good. They're related, but I appreciate your definition there. Anybody? The achievement of equality through different means. Anybody else? Somebody over here?
Accommodations so that people are on equal standing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the image of people standing at a fence of different heights.
You've seen my talk, haven't you?
It's just my favorite.
Equity versus equality. All right, so we're going to talk about those things. This is great definitions. But I'm going to start out by, before I get into talking about equity and genomics, I'm going to talk about Patty. What? So these are some photos. This was in Nigeria with Clement, and we were training folks in Nigeria. This one is Kenya with one of our team members there. That's Patty and me. And all of you in this room know Patty. Some who are live streaming may not know her as well. But if you know Patty, you know she works really, really hard. Really, really hard. But you know she also plays a lot and loves to have fun. And I'm going to show some pictures, Patty. So here we're working, right? Avid note taker, right? Yes, she is. Always taking notes. So there's Patty, and that was in Kenya. And this is in Nigeria, meeting with the chief, and that's Charles over there, and folks there. So we worked a lot during the HapMap project, and learned a lot about these countries, Kenya, Nigeria. We did work in South Africa as well. But we also learned a lot about each other, and realized that we have probably have more in common than we thought we did. So now it's playtime. So this is at a museum in South Africa. That's Patty and me. This is at Kakamega Forest in Kenya. Remember that, Patty? We and Duncan hanging out in Kakamega Forest. And of course, we shopped. You see who's picking up all this stuff, right? That's in South Africa, shopping in a market in South Africa. And there you go, there's Patty. And so we played, and we had a lot of fun. And as I thought about this talk, I often think of Patty, and I think many will agree with me, as a free spirit. Free spirit. That's a term I often use to describe Patty. And I use that term in a way in my talk, throughout my talk. And the talk for me reminds me of Patty and her free spirit, and what I'm hoping that we could achieve for all of us. So, genomics and equity. So this is an image that one of my students created a long time ago in terms of the human genomics research ecosystem. And this could pretty much be, for biomedical research in general. And this may not be all the entities that are part of that ecosystem. But when I think of equity, and you and many of you in this room work on issues related to a lot of these things in terms of genomics and equity, and focusing on healthcare and people's ability to have access to genomic services. We also think about clinicians and the investigators and the workforce, right? And increasing diversity and achieving equity in the workforce. And of course, the people that we serve. We talk a lot about, and many in this room too have done research on diversifying populations in genomic studies. I'm not going to talk about any of those things because many of you work on those things, and many of us are very familiar with many of these issues in terms of how we often think about equity, funding, who is likely to get their grant funded, right? There are papers that have been written that show inequities in whose grants get scored and whose grants get funded. Journal editors and publications, institutional review boards that review our studies, and how those boards are constituted, and the voices that are on those boards, and thinking about biotech and pharma, and who's included in the studies that those entities do, as well as the studies that researchers and clinicians do. So there are lots of ways that equity comes into play when we're thinking about genetics and genomics, right? And I decide I'm not going to describe the challenges which many people are familiar with. But what I'm going to do is to challenge our thinking about equity as an endpoint, right? So this is an image. Tell me your name over there who talked, Jody? So Jody talked about, there's the other one with the fence, I'm gonna show that as well, right? But this is one that was developed by the RWJ Foundation more recently, looking at equality. Equality is when you give everybody the same thing, right? Not taking into consideration what they really need, right? So giving everybody the same thing. Over here, we give her a bike, she can't ride a bike, right? So we give everybody equal things. Equity is giving people what they need, right? Based on their status in life, based on their identities, based on a number of things, but tailoring what we give to people. So ensuring that people have what they need to thrive and to survive, right? What they need, what is going to help them to be able to thrive, to live productive lives, if we think about this in a broad sense. This image, and many of you have seen this, and this is one that has been critiqued a lot in the literature for all kinds of reasons. There are people who say that, well, we really shouldn't be doing this based on height because that reifies these notions that biological differences are, so many of you, I'm sure, have seen the critiques. We're not going to deal with the critiques. We're just going to use this as it is, right? because this is where I'm going to focus, on liberation. I've been thinking a lot about liberation lately and what liberation actually means, and thinking about equity as something that is important, but wondering if equity is what we need to take us to liberation, right? They're related, right? Equity, making sure that people have what they need, is related to liberation, individual liberation, and collective liberation in some ways. But when I think about liberation, I think primarily about liberation of the mind, liberation of our ideas, liberation of our thoughts that influence our behaviors and our actions, right? And it's this liberation of the mind that will help us to achieve equity that's not just temporary, but lasting, systemic equity. We could remove the inequities if we have enough money to take care of those things. But if we don't change the mindsets, the inequities, we might reduce them, and may reduce them to a large extent. But unless the mindsets about who people think we are, how we relate to each other, what we think, and my work, as you know, focuses primarily on race and racism. But as we know, equity crosses all kinds of identities, right? We talk about gender, we talk about SES and class. So I'm thinking about all of it, right? All of it. Our mindsets, the way we think about who people are, their worth, what they're capable of doing, has a lot to do with how we treat them, the attitudes we have, and whether or not those people really are able to achieve equity. And one of the things that has really brought this home to me is the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation movement. So I direct a center at Duke called the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And that center at Duke is one of about 70 across the United States. Started with some seed money from the Kellogg Foundation. And in 2016, 2017, the Kellogg Foundation, under the guidance of Dr. Gail Christopher, she was senior vice president at Kellogg at the time, and she's somebody I worked with when I was at Howard. She used to be at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And when I left Howard in 2007 to go to Duke, she went to the Kellogg Foundation as senior vice president. And she started this movement called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And it resonated with me when I read about it, because it is exactly what I have been trying to do in my work. And Dr. Christopher has been a long-standing policy change agent, has worked a lot in health policy, and has seen policies come and go. And her thought has been, you know, we can develop policies, but if somebody comes in, and we see it happening now, with a different mindset, those policies can change overnight, right? Policies alone are not going to fix our problems in terms of equity. It's the liberation of the mind that's going to ultimately cause the change that we seek, the sustained, the permanent, the lasting, the systemic change. And so the Kellogg Foundation put a lot of funding actually in community-based organizations to do this, and then collaborated with the Association of American Colleges and Universities to start centers on campuses. And Duke was one of the first 10, so there were 10 in 2017 that got some seed money from Kellogg, and then our institution has provided additional funding. But these centers are aimed at helping students, and Dr. Christopher sees the academy, a place of learning where we think about these things and where knowledge influences our ideas and our thoughts and ultimately our behaviors. And then the idea is that campuses will be places where these changes can happen, can emerge, and can be sustained. And this is a quote from Gail. TRHT's transformation goal involves racial healing and requires the imagination. That's what I told you I want you to envision with me. We're going to use the imagination. Imagine the world that we want to live in, the world with equity, where equity abounds. But realizing that, well, the point I'm trying to make, and the case I'm trying to make, is that equity that we're seeking, the long-standing systemic equity, is dependent on our minds and how we think, right? And so the TRHT framework, this is the framework that undergirds that movement and that guides all of the work. And it starts with narrative change. And this is a framework, I'm not gonna go into it, but it has 5 pillars. Narrative change is how we think. And again, the TRHT work is based solely on race. It is all about race and racism. And she's intentional about that, and I'm intentional about that, because that's what I focus on. Not wanting to dilute the work on race and racism, right? And so this work is on race. But if you look at this framework, you see that this could apply to just about any identity, right? How we change the narrative, and thinking of race, what is race? How do we think about biological race or biological concepts of race versus social constructs of race, right? And how people know and understand what race is and what it's not. And these entities that have a lot to do with knowledge and information and their roles in changing the narrative about both race and racism. Racial healing and relationship building in this framework is one of the core pillars, because Gail believes, and we who have adopted the framework, that without relationships, right, we can make some changes if we change the structure. So these 3 pillars that you see here, separation, law, and the economy, these are primary tools of racism. Primary tools of racism. These are the structural barriers that we need to break down, right? And so this framework, and which is why I love it so much, is that it's holistic. It includes the narrative, the personal, it includes the interpersonal, the relationships, and it includes the structural, all of it. Not just thinking that we got to just change policies. If we change policies and we don't build relationships across these divides, we don't change the narratives, we don't change how we think or what we know about these things, then we're not gonna, we'll make some progress, but the progress won't be sustained. So in thinking about liberation, thinking about equity, I'm gonna give some examples where I see the opportunities for change, the opportunities and some challenges too, for how genomics as a field is already trying to do some of this work. And what I want us to think about is how we sustain that kind of work, right? How we do the hard work, right? Policies are not easy to make, but they're easier than changing a mind, right? And many people will say, you work on the policies, I'll work on the policies, you can go try to change people's mind, and I've heard that, right? And I have no problem doing that, because I believe that there are things that we can do to change the way people think. Of course, it's not gonna happen overnight, but part of it is the relationship building, part of what we do. But what you see here are the Human Genome Project, the draft sequence in 2001, and of course this year is the 20th anniversary of the completed human genome. But recently, we had the publication from the Human Pangenome. And the Human Pangenome Reference Consortium is the latest iteration of human genome projects, right? And Eric, who was there in the beginning of the HGP and seeing HapMap and 1,000 genomes and all of these, we're at the Pangenome, right? And the Pangenome is aimed at creating a more complete genome. The technology has advanced to the level that we can do what we call long-read sequencing, that we're doing more deep sequencing of the genome. But the reference, the desire is also to get greater representation in terms of diversity, ethnic, ancestral diversity. And that was published recently. And I think the Human Pangenome has a lot of potential, certainly in terms of the science, to change what we know and what we think we know about human genetic variation, and to give us some deeper knowledge about variation in the human genome. But I think it also has a potential. So now they just finished the first 5 years of wrapping it up and thinking about and moving into the next 5 years, where the plans are to recruit more diverse samples, and the question of how we even sample, right? How do we sample human populations in ways that are equitable, in ways that are scientifically grounded, right? For HapMap and for thousands of genomes, a lot of that work was convenient sampling, right? A lot of it was. And a lot of the large-scale human genome work has been. But the pan-human genome project, I think, has the opportunity to do things a little differently and to do them a little more rigorously. When I think about the Human Genome Project and changing the mindset and how we think and what we believe, I think about Georgia Dunstan, and I know some people in here know Georgia. Georgia Dunstan led the Human Genome Center at Howard. She was my professor when I was a genetics student at Howard. And I remember when the Human Genome Project first started, at least before it started in 1990, and she taught immunogenetics, which she's a immunogeneticist. And I remember the textbooks at the time talked about us having about 97% or so of the human genome was well, we didn't talk about the genome then, but was junk DNA, right? I'm sure many people in here remember that term, junk DNA. And I remember Georgia used to say to us, and she used to say to me, Charmaine, there is no such thing. God does not make junk. She said, it's not junk, mark my word. And this was before the Genome Project found out that it's not junk, right? Thinking outside of the box, she said, it's not junk. What we know now is that that 97, 98% helps the 3% do what it needs to do, right? So there's a lot of work now trying to understand that 97% of junk, right? So how we think has a lot to do with what we do, and thinking outside of the box as opposed to just accepting the status quo is what we need to do in many situations for us to enact change. I think also about the precision medicine work. And how am I doing on time? I'm good. Okay, all right. I told myself I wasn't going to talk too long, but I think I'm talking long. But so thinking about precision medicine, and I'm sure most people have heard of precision medicine, the Precision Medicine Initiative, precision health. As some people are saying now, it's not precision medicine. We need to talk about precision health, and there are all these things about precision. This is the cover of the National Academy's report on precision medicine. And I was a member of that committee that published that report. And I remember when we were working on that report, there was a lot of talk about how we were going to structure this thing, right? And our charge from the NIH for that report was to create a framework create a framework for a new taxonomy of disease, how we think about disease, based on molecular biology, right? So what we had been finding from the Human Genome Project is that we were finding variants in the genome that were the same variant influencing different diseases, right? And vice versa. Different variants influencing the same disease. We look at breast cancer, we have HER2 breast cancer, right? So looking at we were able to lump and split diseases based on genetic and genomic information. And that was our charge, to develop a new framework, for a new taxonomy, a new way of thinking about disease. There's the ICD-9 codes that's used by the WHO, looking at those codes and thinking about how do we really think about disease. Do we think about signs and symptoms versus something else? And as we worked through that report, it became clear to us that we couldn't just focus on molecular biology, right? And hence the report was a comprehensive report that talked about, and you can't read this, I'm sorry things are so fuzzy, but you can't really read this, but this is looking at various levels of information. So this exposome, which you can't read, the genome, the microbiome, but various levels of biological information, and we added the exposome, which is exposures, right? And our goal in this was that we needed to create an information commons that would comprise not just genetic and other biological information, but that we needed to think about the genome in context of the environment, of people's experiences, people's exposures. And then that information would inform biomedical research and clinical medicine, and hence the taxonomy and diagnosis and all of that would be influenced. So that report that we developed is developed with complexity in mind, and complexity that includes social and environmental factors. And hence the All of Us program that has come out of that has this model, right? What happens though is that when I talk to a lot of people, and when I talk to my students also, and I ask about precision medicine, is that many people still define it in terms of genomics. Even geneticists still define it, and it's just hard to think about anything but genetics, right? And I'm a human geneticist and I love the genome, but the genome is not everything. It doesn't tell us the whole story. And so even thinking about precision medicine and the potential that that work, precision health, has for how we integrate all aspects of who we are as humans. Again, unless we're integrating everything, we can't liberate ourselves. We can't liberate our minds, and our liberation of our minds influences liberation of our bodies as well. I'm gonna go quickly through one example that I like to talk about with the sickle cell disease. I think sickle cell disease is the most fascinating disease. Yeah, that's my view. It's what I did my dissertation work on. And one of the things that I think makes sickle cell disease fascinating is that it's a Mendelian disease, right? You can't get it unless you inherit those variants from your parents, right? But once you get it, there's no telling how severely you're going to be affected. There's no telling what complications you're going to have. And these are some milestones from sickle cell disease, the 1910 publication, the first clinical publication in the US. When I talk with many of my African colleagues, they're saying, we probably had some publications on this way back when, before there were publications. But nobody knows about those, right? But at least in the US, 1910. And then sickle cell disease was always also the first disease in 1949 to be described as a molecular disease, Linus Pauling's work. So we know a lot about sickle cell disease, a lot about it. But there's still a lot that we don't know, right? Very global. Most of the people affected by sickle cell disease are in parts of Africa, not all parts of Africa. South Africa, Southern Africa doesn't have much sickle cell disease. But most of the people with sickle cell disease live in 3 countries, in Nigeria, the Congo, and India. Most of the people, up to 90% or so of people. But sickle cell disease is found all over the globe, right? Because it's linked to malaria, and you know all of that. I don't have to tell you that part. But the global nature of it is important. Important as we think about liberation. Sickle cell disease affects just about every organ of the body, right? A variant that affects the hemoglobin causes red cells to become sticky, and that's what causes the occlusion, the clogging of the vessels, and lots of problems. But many people never think about sickle cell disease as a health disparities condition, because many people say, well, mostly, at least in the US, most of the people who get sickle cell disease are Black or self-identify as Black. And many people say, well, the differences between who gets it is all because of, ancestry and all of that. But as I said before, thinking about who gets it and thinking about how people's experience with it is quite different. So there are various measures in terms of the disparities and the outcome for people with sickle cell disease, and some of that, yes, is based on just the disease and the severity of the disease, but some of it is also based on the care that people get, and which also is part of the health disparities story. And we've known for a long time that genes, of course, are a major part of sickle cell disease. You can't get it unless you inherit those variants. But we've also known that a lot of other factors, including temperature and climate and socioeconomic status and a variety of things also influence outcome for sickle cell disease. And many people have looked at these non-genetic factors, and then people who are looking at the genetic factors, but not too many people are trying to bring these things together. And that is one of the things that I'm very interested in, my team and I, and very much interested in looking at all of these factors that influence sickle cell disease and seeing sickle cell disease as a model to help us understand complexity, not just of Mendelian conditions, but also complexity of more complex conditions. Right? I'm going to try to wrap up because I know we've got to be done. So I'm going to move on. So these are also some things with sickle cell disease. In thinking also about liberation and new ways of thinking, this is a report that I know many people are familiar with that just came out on population descriptors. And as we were thinking about how we're going to frame this report in terms of what was going to change, right? A lot of people have been trying to address race and genetics for a long time, and how we use or whether we use that. And I'm just going to focus on those requisites up there, right? Avoid typological thinking, measure environmental factors. These are things we're calling on researchers who do genetics. And not all people who do genetics call themselves geneticists, but genetics is used by scientists and researchers, whether they're geneticists or not. And then, of course, engaging communities, right? Those first two call for a change in thinking. There are times that we've presented this report many times, and there were times that people would say, well, that typological thinking, how do we do that, right? How do we change people's thinking? And that is what I want to challenge us all to think about. What are the new models that we need to create to help us think about? This is by Buckminster Fuller, who was an inventor but also a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Effective social change agent, very much so. And this is a quote that he uses that I really like, and Dr. Gray, who used it in TRHT, that don't fight the existing model, right? Don't fight the existing model. Come up with a new model to address what it is you're trying to do that will make that existing model obsolete. And when I'm thinking about models, my question is, what model are we going to create for human genetics that makes equity, not just equity, the endpoint, but make liberation part of the equation, right? Realizing that equity is a part of the solution. But unless we really change the way people think, equity is just a stepping stone to something that we have not yet achieved, right? And so as I wrap up, Patty and I, as we travel through Africa, just love to hang out with the children. And this is a photo of children in South Africa. Ignore the adults in the background, please. But this is a photo, and I know Patty had framed one of these and put in her office at one point. And these are the children. And when I think about liberation and liberation of the mind and equity and how we think about giving people what they need to thrive and survive, and having that be sustained, the liberation that is needed for these children to thrive and to survive. So it's about us, the world we want to live in, imagining that world and what it's going to take to liberate the minds, but also the world for these children and all the children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. My name's Jacob Rich.
Hi, Jacob.
Hi. I do work on population health, looking at the effects of the drug war. Mm-hmm. Some of it has to do with inequities in arrest and recent inequities in overdose mortality. And the question I'm asking is in regards to the American Heart Association's recent decision to remove race from its predictive model in trying to predict heart disease. And I've seen you comment on similar things, so I just wanted to read a quote from you. You said that race should never be used as a proxy for human genetic variation. So I'm curious why, that's a very strong statement. So if race is included in a model and it increases the predictive abilities of that model, is race not measuring genetic factors? It's measuring environmental factors? Okay. I'm just saying, like, if race can improve a model, why shouldn't it be used?
Great question. Okay, so
Can you answer from the mic?
oh, sorry. All right. Okay. So thinking about race in predictive models, right? And we've been seeing the movement, the removal of race from the EGFR and other algorithms. What we say in the National Academy's report, and I stand by, is that race should never be used as a proxy for genetic variation. Race might be, we didn't say you shouldn't use race, and many people misunderstand our report as saying never use race. What we did say, though, is that a researcher needs to think about why they're using race and how they might be using it. If they're using it as a proxy for environmental factors that they're not measuring, and of course we're saying measure the environmental factors if you can, right? But it can be a proxy for some experiential factors. It can be a proxy for environmental factors. But if you're going to use it as a proxy for those factors, in our report, we said it needs to be clear that that's why you're using race. So we think under no circumstance should race, because not using race as a proxy for genetic variation is in line with the fact that we don't have biological race as humans. And so if you're saying race and you're intending it as a biological factor, that's a fallacy. That's erroneous work, right? And we're trying to hold researchers accountable for doing rigorous work and not misleading work. And so if you're using race, say why you're using it. But in our report and in the table that we provided, from chapter 5, where we provide guidance for researchers, we say in most cases, you may not need to use race. There may be something else that's more useful. So what we're asking researchers to do is to tailor their use of population descriptors to the research questions that they're asking. If you're trying to understand social impacts on health, then use social variables. If you're trying to understand biological impacts on health, then look at biological factors. And very often we conflate this, which is why the report was written in the first place, is that we tend to conflate these and send mixed messages about what race is and what it is not. Because the idea, if we're using race as a biological factor, that has a lot of implications for how people interpret the findings, right? In terms of what's really causing any differences that we're seeing between these racialized groups that we're looking at. And so wanting researchers to be very clear and our goal is to advance more rigorous research. I hope that's helpful.
Just a quick follow-up. I completely understand if the interpretation is one of the major concerns. I guess just the way that I look at it is from a clinician's perspective. I'm not a clinician, but I can think of how clinicians would look at it. Mm-hmm. What if they erroneously say, we're going to use race as a proxy for biology, and then that adds to the predictive nature of the model? If it improves it, I guess that's where I'm thinking. I'm if it improves the predictive nature of the model, should it still be removed?
When you say improve the predictive nature of the model, it depends on what you're looking at. So in a study that we just did with physicians at Duke, most of the doctors that we interviewed said they do not believe that humans have biological race. But then most of them also said that race should be used in clinical practice because of its genetic value. That's contradictory, right? And so when doctors are using race in medicine, in many cases, they're using it as a biological variable. And using that and doing that masks what may actually be going on with that patient, right? If you're thinking about the biological, the questions about what that patient can do to change that, the questions about what we may do to fix that problem, we're also always going to be thinking of some drug, right? Fix the problem. When it may not be a drug that's needed. They may need to have some healthy food to eat. And if we don't ask those questions about these other aspects of people's lives, then we'll just assume that it's all biological. And so just really wanting much more rigor, in our work, and to be more specific about what we're looking at based on, be more specific about what we're using based on what the research questions are.
You're reminding me, this dialogue back and forth is reminding me about the importance of thinking through underlying assumptions that we make when we construct a question when we think about, I'm thinking a research question here, Charmaine. When we construct a research question and we think about what kinds of methods we want to use, it's so vitally important to step back and think also about the underlying assumptions that we are making in relation to not just the questions that we want to answer, but the methods that we used, and to use the way that you said. Just a quick follow-up. My quick follow-up, based on Charmaine, your presentation, is that you don't get very far without asking those questions. You do not get very far to a point of liberation, which is so challenging.
It is.
I mean, especially when I think about the world right now, the world that we're living in. You know, I just moved to be closer to family. I'm still just so immersed in my world here. But I moved to a small town called Vandalia. It's right adjacent to the north of Dayton. And it's a totally different world. And being a good social scientist, a good anthropologist, one of the first things I did, I looked up the demographics of the area, and I was just like almost embarrassed because, you guys, it's 95% white. So I just moved from Cleveland Heights, next door neighbor, African American, down the street, Indians. I mean, so diverse, and that kind of frightened me a little. Here I am in Dayton, looking out at a Trump sign, and I'm like, oh my God in heaven. And Charmaine, you know, do you remember you put up Buckminster Fuller's, you know, I have visions when I see his name or quotes. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, go there. Oh yeah. But I think, how can I make a difference in my community now? I've made friends with the people across the street who frightened me in the beginning, the ones who had a Trump sign. I mean, that's so, how can I say it, you guys? It's so totally opposite of how I think about my own efforts to be more liberated, or my own efforts to practice more at, you know, as you said, Charmaine, shifting models. That's a challenge for all
And
of
also
us.
building relationships with those people, right?
Yeah.
That's part of it. That's what
And-
truth, racial healing, and is building relationships with people who you have who think differently about these
And
issues.
that
It's hard.
That
But
was
that's part of
really
it.
hard. Yeah. Oh, Aaron, I'm sorry. Here.
I just had a question that actually kind of follows nicely with some of your points, Patty. So I feel like in the genomics community at NIH, other places, we've worked very, very hard to get equity on the table, right? To make sure that equity becomes a focus of grants, of committees. How do we
And now I'm
then?
taking it out.
Yeah, no. How do we then proceed to, you know, think even beyond equity towards your notion of liberation? And I really like the idea of kind of thinking about equity not being the end goal, but part of this movement. How do we do that as a community? How do we get NIH and other entities to start thinking along those lines, given not always, but how much sometimes of a struggle it is to get even equity on the table.
Good question, which I was hoping you would help me answer. Like I said, I think I came in here with more questions than answers, but wanting us to think about that. You know, when I think about our work, and a lot of what we do in relation to equity has to do with things that are happening on the ground and changing the way things are being done, but also changing policies and guidelines and procedures, right? I think in addition to doing that work, we have to figure out how, it's how we sustain that. And I think, and as I said before, we've been doing work related to equity and we see it come and go, right? I mean, I think more is being done now. But I think ensuring that that along with changing the policies and what I call the changing the policies to address the consequences of these inequities, that we try to get to the root cause, right? So a lot of what we've been doing, health disparities, education disparities, wealth disparities, is addressing the consequences of all of these things, of the inequities. But trying to get to the root cause, which is the ideology, right? And a part of changing ideology, as I said before, is interacting with people with different ideologies, right? And that's part of the TRHT model, because when we do, there's one methodology that's core to TRHT work, which is called racial healing circles. And again, the work is focused on race. And it's bringing together people from different racialized groups. That's the idea, right? Sometimes we don't always achieve that. But bringing people from different racialized groups in a circle, and these circles are based on indigenous practices from Africa, from Native Americans, to share stories. To share stories, not about people's racialized experiences, right? Because Gail and the TRHT movement is adamant that we don't want to re-traumatize people. There's a place for that, but that's not what racial healing circles are about. Racial healing circles, and I think any conversation, people are talking about civil discourse, right? And the idea is to get people together around topics that we share in common as humans, right? And I think the more conversation we have about the things we have in common, the more we realize how similar we are than different. And those things will help bring us together and get us to that freedom of the mind and freedom of take the chains that bind us in these ideas about what our fellow human or our other humans are and who they are and what they're worth and all that. That freedom of the mind allows us to connect with people. Martin Luther King in 1962, a talk he gave at Cornell College in Iowa, he said, and I'm gonna hope should I remember this now. He said, "Men hate each other because they fear each other." And men, back then we said men, but I just say people, right? Hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. They don't communicate with each other because they've been separated. Separation, one of the pillars of is a core tool of racism. We see it in apartheid, we see it's core. The more you can separate people and have them think that they're so different from the next person, is the more you can have these ideas just percolate. And that liberation is not going to happen with separation, right? So whether it's looking at other kinds of identities, but just other areas of equity or inequity, the more we can bring people together to understand each other's experience and understand that my experience is your experience, right? And so how we do that in the ELSI world, lots of people who do ELSI work are humanists, social scientists who know about storytelling. We probably need to do more of that in our work. And we talk about community engagement. Our community engagements may need to be a little more rigorous, right? As opposed to just focusing on what you're going to do for me for my study, right? But helping the researcher and the communities connect at a heart level that make the researcher realize, oh my gosh, these people are people just like me. You know, they have knowledge, I have knowledge. We share knowledge, right? I don't know what they know. They may not know what I know, but we can communicate with each other as humans. And that's the key. So if we can build that into LC work, then we'll be good.
Just to go back to your beginning slides about equity. And my name is Peter Hart, by the way. I'm in the Genetics and Genome Sciences department here. An early thinker about equity, I think, was a mid-19th century, I guess we didn't call them quite sociologists yet, but emerging sociologists. And I'll let you, as everyone as homework, can look this up on the web to see who this is. But he said, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. And that's essentially what the cartoons say. So it's not that we haven't thought of this idea until, last month. It's that in the United States, we have a tremendous difficulty accepting it for reasons that require a much longer conversation.
Can I take a microphone holder's privilege and just say one additional thing, which is, I think it's a powerful thing to think about how policy and mental change, imaginary change, imagination change, work together, interact. And I think about desegregation of schools, for example, or legalizing same-sex marriage, for example, and the ways that public opinion shifted so rapidly before and after those big changes in policy that were very resisted ahead of time. And then once they were in place, that mental shift that you're talking about of, oh, these people are just like me, could happen so much more quickly. And so I'm really struck by how policy can make infrastructure by which that kind of imagination shift can happen on a broad scale, not just one by one or in small groups.
That's right, and that's a great point, Marcia. And I didn't mean to give the idea that policy has to be separate from these other things, right? So the connections that you're making are absolutely on point. That they have to work together, right? They have to work together for the policies to. Oh.
Thank you. Excuse me. I was texting because a few friends that are watching virtually wanted me to ask a question for them. And, we talked a little bit in the beginning about, these efforts to diversify our genomic research and, but thinking about at the same time, using these social constructs of these groupings to increase certain representation within the data sets, and how at the same time we're pushing ourselves to imagine differently. And just asking if you could share a few thoughts on those two things happening at the same time.
All right, thank you. And we talk a little bit about this in Population Descriptors report, in that researchers, not just genetics and genomics researchers, but researchers in general, biomedical researchers, many, I don't want to use the word misunderstand, but many think that the requirement to use OMB categories, and we have those requirements from NIH, from the FDA, from other federal agencies, to use OMB categories to report your findings. And when you write an NIH grant, you got to fill out that enrollment table, and we got to report. But you don't have to use those categories as an analytic category, right? And that is what our report is about, how we do our analyses, right? And not using race as an analytic category if it's not responding to the questions you're trying to ask, right? So one could recruit based on these the defined categories to ensure that you're meeting those requirements and getting people from those identified groups in your studies. But when you're analyzing your data, researchers do have the flexibility and the responsibility, and many don't know, that they can disaggregate their data in other ways that are more scientifically rigorous. And that's what we call on researchers to do. Many researchers they use them for recruiting and they use them for analyses, right? And so we're calling on researchers to diversify your populations or your samples or your cohorts based on these socially defined categories so we can diversify our study cohorts. But when it comes to analysis, and trying to understand the scientific underpinnings of whatever outcomes you're looking at, then you might need to look at your data a little differently and categorize those groups in different ways. Right?
We have a few more minutes for questions. I want to see if any students have any questions. We have a lot of students, genetic counseling students, genetic students, or bioethics students. Are there any questions?
Oh, we have genetic counseling students in here too, yes. All right. We have a hand.
Hello. I love the idea about looking towards liberation instead of equity, because I feel like most discussions don't really include the idea of liberation. I feel like most people go towards equity because it's easier and they get less pushback. So I was wondering, to what extent do policy or efforts towards equity prevent liberation in the end?
What's your name? Faye? Faye. All right, Faye. I have to think about that one, about liberation, about equity preventing liberation, because I see them as connected. Let's see. So you're thinking that work toward equity prevents people from thinking about liberation, or it impedes liberation?
Well, thinking back to the picture you showed about the fence and the little boxes that people were standing on, but because they have those boxes, now it's like, oh, we don't have to remove the fence because there is going around.
Okay. Well, the removal of the fence is removing the barrier that made you need those boxes in the first place, right? And so I imagine it's whatever the policies are, and it will be for different policies or different problems. Thinking about, once you remove those inequities, what other barriers are there, right? What seen or unseen barriers are there that you didn't attend to? And some of them may be those barriers of the mind in terms of how those groups, those people in those groups, whatever they are perceived, or even how those people themselves perceive themselves based on what society tells them they are, right? Because those are also things that affect the liberation of the mind, right? Not just what people think you are, but what you think you are. And society has a way of telling you what you are and treating you in particular ways that over time you begin to believe it yourself, right? And so trying to understand what the seen and unseen obstacles are to total liberation for those groups, those individuals. It's not just making sure that, they have some food to eat, right? But people are still seeing them as being inferior, right? Or they're still seeing themselves as less than. So trying to figure out what other barriers there might be that may be impeding full liberation, or even that may be impeding greater equity, right? For those folks, right? Which again, it requires imagination. We have to think. If we just accept what we see, then we're not imagining a better world, a better way, and we have to be intentional about that. It's not just going to happen. We have to be intentional about realizing that there's got to be something more that's going to bring us the sustained change. People have been doing change work for a long time, right? But it's 2023 and we're still talking about racism, and we're still talking about sexism, and we're still talking about all these isms and these things. Why is that? The mind. The mind, we know how powerful it is, right? And the mind, of course, but also the structures that perpetuate and maintain what the mind says people are and what they're not.
Just kind of going off what Faye was saying, I was just thinking as you were talking about like equity and liberation, and just as an example first, there's a children's book, my mom's a teacher and she told me about it, and there's like a little dragon boy and a little human boy who are pen pals, and the other thinks the other is a human and a dragon. And so they've become great friends, and then when they meet in person, they were like, whoa, humans and dragons are actually great, and they, happy ending. But having that kind of ignorance of the other person, and then being able to establish that relationship, going back to like equity, do you think it might be a barrier to be thinking like, to not have that ignorance when you're thinking about equity, because they were able to become, I guess, liberated almost in the children's book by, yes, to have the ignorance.
Yeah. But it's even better if you understand the difference, because we also want to celebrate difference. We also want to celebrate diversity, right? We want to celebrate diversity as well as our common humanity, right? They're both to be celebrated. So not because, so difference is good in and of itself. It's when we rank those differences that we get into problems, right? And so having people appreciate the differences, right? If we all look the same, we wouldn't survive as a species. If we all were the same, we would not, right? And so difference is important to our very survival. Right? And so appreciating that difference and the diversity, and looking at, when I look across this room and I see the beautiful hues and different features, that's all part of the diversity that we must celebrate, but also realize that there is a common humanity. So appreciate the diversity, celebrate the common humanity. Right? There might be some benefit to not knowing and seeing that you're different, but it's also important to see the difference and appreciate the difference. Does that answer your question? Right. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Great questions.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to all those of you who are online. Just a couple quick announcements and just a little presentation. First, I want to just thank especially our students for being here, our bioethics and medical humanities students, our genetics and genetic counseling students. It really means a lot to have students in the audience and be part of this dialogue and be part of our conversations. You bring so much to what we do daily and in our work. I want to just announce that this conversation is going to continue tomorrow in honor of the 20th anniversary of the human genome. There's a whole day of discussions and lectures and interactions sponsored by the Courtney Burton Frontiers of Medicine Symposium. It will take place in this room starting at 10 a.m. There's also a public event at the Natural History Museum tomorrow night with the speakers from tomorrow that you need to register for, so you need to go online and register. But we really invite you to come tomorrow and continue. We have there's some amazing speakers coming tomorrow to continue this conversation and to be part of this celebration of the 20th anniversary of sequencing the human genome. So I encourage those of you who are already not planning on coming, but to come tomorrow and continue this amazing conversation. If you have any questions about that, there are a few of us around that can answer any questions about tomorrow's events. I want to I have our leadership team up here, Marcia Mickey, our associate director, and Lynette Gerardo, our scientific director, here to present Charmaine, to thank her for her amazing talk and for engaging with all of us. Thank you so much for being our second annual speaker for the Patty Marshall Lecture on Genomics and Equity. Here you are.
Thank you very much.
And we also have you can see if you come to our department, our plaque that we'll be adding to every year. That's in honor of Patty and the work of the center. And we encourage you to stick around for the reception after. There's some information about our center, and engage with us and with Dr. Royal. And thank you all for being here. What a wonderful session. Thank you.